Hi, I'm Brian Worley for the Photographer Academy, and in this video I'm going to talk about metering. So your camera, DSLR camera, automatically measures the light that comes through the lens to determine what's the correct exposure for you. If you're using manual, most cameras will use the metering as a guide to help you set your choice of shutter speed and aperture. But if you're using aperture priority, shutter priority or program, or even the automatic modes, the camera's going to use that metering information to determine the correct exposure. Now in the main, when you've got a good scene where you've got a mixture of brights and dark areas, the cameras do a pretty good job. And these days the clever evaluative or the matrix pattern meterings actually do really good jobs. But when you have a subject that's a little bit tricky, and a tricky subject can be something as simple as a very bright subject or a very dark subject. So in terms of bright subjects, you might be thinking something like, if you're going to photograph in the snow is a really, really bright environment. And so if you photograph polar bears in the snow, invariably your pictures will look a little bit underexposed. If your preferred choice of photos involves lots of dark environments, so if you shoot black cats in coal cellars, for example, then you're going to get black pictures, but not shown as black. They're going to come out very grey. So in fact, the camera will overexpose them. And the reason it does that is because it's using the light that's reflected off of your subject. So if your subject is bright and it's white or light coloured, it will reflect more light. Whereas if it's a dark subject, like the ones I've got behind me, the black parts, they're going to reflect less light back. And that means that the camera will get the exposure wrong. Now you can use a little bit of experience, and certainly you can use the histograms on the camera to help you determine, has the camera got it right, or do you need to step in and make some adjustment, perhaps using the exposure compensation dial, or maybe you need to switch to manual. So let's go and try and take a couple of example pictures, because we've got some nice flat light today. So I'm going to take a piece of the wall behind me with the camera pointed at the white section, and we'll look at the exposure metering for that. And then we'll point the camera solely at the black section so that we can see the difference. Now, actual fact, the exposure for both is the same because they're lit by the same level of brightness. And now perhaps we'll take a wider shot with both elements in to see if the camera gives us a more mid-ground effect. So we're now outside and we've got flat overcast lighting, which is actually quite a good test with our white wall and our black wall. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take two pictures. The first one is of the white wall. Now the camera's actually going to underexpose because the white's going to reflect more light than it would be if it was mid-grey, which is what the camera's aiming for. In the case of the black one, it's going to reflect less light, so the camera's going to overexpose. So let me just take those two pictures and then we'll see and compare the exposure settings the camera's chosen. I'm using aperture priority and I've locked my ISO to 100 so that only the shutter speed will change. So I've just taken these two pictures, and looking at the back of my camera I can check the shutter speed to give me an idea of how different the camera's recorded. And what I'm seeing is that the sector on the white wall is actually taken 160th of a second at f8. And when we photograph the black panel next to it, it's giving me an 1/8 of a second. And what I'm seeing in the histograms is that in the case of the white, in both cases, I've actually got very much a central spike in my histogram. And that's because the camera has tried to create a mid-toned exposure. Because in actual fact, that's its goal. As far as the cameras are concerned, if everything was mid-grey, they'd be very, very happy. And that's their aim. So my two histograms look very similar, but my two pictures, the white one is too dark, the black one is too light. If I was trying to get an average across both, I'd need to include both elements in the frame. I'm just going to do that one now. So I've now got another exposure which actually is a midpoint. Now I included pretty much half the frame of black and half the frame of white. By taking the picture of both, my histograms move such that I have a spike in the histogram for where the black part of the frame is, and I have a spike to the right side where the highlights part of the frame is. And that gives me a midpoint on my exposure, gives me the exposure that I want. So far I've used evaluative metering on this camera, which is similar to the matrix metering found on others. But usually cameras these days offer a multitude of metering patterns. This one offers 4 of the common ones, and they are the evaluative one, a center weighted pattern, which tends to weight most of the attention in the center of the frame and disregards pretty much the top part of the frame, because normally that would be covered by sky, particularly if you're shooting with the camera held horizontally. And that's a pattern that used to be commonly found on film cameras in the past. There's also a partial metering pattern, which takes a reading from the very center of the frame, usually around 10 to 15% of the center, pretty much where your center focus point is covering. And then there's a spot meter. And the spot meter takes a real tiny section of the front center. So the spot meter, whilst it's very accurate and very precise, you need to be sure that you're pointing it at something that is mid-toned, or that you understand how much brighter than mid-toned your subject is. So those are the 4 metering patterns on the camera. It's important that you study your instruction books, because you'll find that on some cameras, the camera will automatically lock the exposure in some metering patterns, but not others. On the Canon cameras, certainly it locks the exposure when you half press the shutter when it's in evaluative, but if you're using spot, partial or center weighted, there's no automatic exposure lock, in which case you need to use the star button on the back of the camera to lock the exposure when you've measured the brightness of your mid-tone subject. So we've seen how the camera meter can be confused by very light subjects or very dark subjects. So how do you cope with that, deal with that situation? One of the great tricks is actually that green grass, traditional grass, not if it's parched out, but not regular green grass, it's got a similar reflectance as actually a grey card. So you can simply set your camera for spot metering and take a reading off of the grass on the ground, and that will give you a base point for your exposures, which is actually a pretty good grey card when you haven't got a grey card with you. So I've just talked about using grass as a temporary grey card when you don't have anything else. But what should you use? Well, this is a Lastalite Expo balance, and it provides a grey, a black and a white. So you can use this to set your metering from. In this case, I'm going to use the camera with a spot meter to measure from the grey section here, which is mid-grey, so it will give me a good, accurate mid-tone for the camera to measure from. And we'll just put that into the frame. And that then gives me my exposure by taking the spot meter off there. So we've seen how we can use the grey card to give us an accurate meter reading when it's in a normal overcast day like today, we've got a very even light. But how would you work when the light's changing? Say you're working in an environment where you're shifting from shade to bright sunshine, or maybe when you're working indoors and you've got some spaces which are more lit than others. In those cases, you'll need to be paying real attention to the light meter and noticing what you're measuring from, because they will have different amounts of light on them. And since the cameras, as we've seen, is using what's reflected from your subject, if the level of light that's being reflected changes a lot, you also need to be paying careful attention with your metering, and you'll be using the grey cards much more often. I'm Brian Worley for the Photographer Academy, and I hope to see you soon.